Dorothy Parker, right? She was known as a kind of like humorist, right? She first became famous when she was writing these kinds of like, I guess, reviews. Sometimes they're like very harsh reviews, funny reviews. I have this collection, right? The Portable Dorothy Parker. She put this together herself, actually, or most of it rather, at least when it comes to the fiction. I don't think she selected any of the nonfiction for it. So there's fiction in there, there's poetry in there. I read actually about half of it. So I can't say for certain that this is Dorothy Parker's best short story. But when when I read it compared to the previous short stories in this book, it immediately stood out as just like far more, like she always has like some compression and dark humor, but it's much more compressed. Like you see like just like from the first page or two that there's going to be a lot of stuff going on here. These are going to be well sketched characters. This is going to be stuff that we are that we're going to develop some sort of like, attachment to, right? Whether or not we relate to a character or we root for someone or whatnot. But she never really thought too highly of her own talent, right? She constantly, was like on this quest to write a novel. She did not successfully do that. She gave up a novel. I think this is her longest story. So I guess this is the closest that she came to writing a novel. I don't really know exactly what happened with that, but she also had, personal problems with various addictions. I think she was addicted to alcohol. At some point, she just completely stopped writing because she would start sort of, sipping on alcohol, I guess early in the morning, and then it would sort of snowball from there, and she was just constantly drunk. Similar to, I guess, when I did the thing with Joel Parrish, Artifact, what was number 7, with John Williams, right? He also had this kind of like low grade dependence, but hers actually interfered with her work, right? By the time she hit, I believe, her 40s and 50s. And some of the questions that I want to ask is, the protagonist, Hazel Morse, right? What does this character even want? Is it worthwhile, right? This is oftentimes thought of as like a very kind of like feminist critique of society. When I read some of the stuff that's been written about it, like contemporary work, people say that clearly this is an example of like Hazel Morse being oppressed by others. I'm not so sure about that. Like, although there's definitely elements of that, right? So these are some of the questions that I want to talk about, right? Like is she in fact socially constrained, or is she explicitly herself self-destructive, right? Because we could see, right, some of the stuff that happened to Dorothy Parker within Hazel Morse, right? This was like famously supposed to be a little bit autobiographical. And the final question is like, is that disconnect, right? Like, is that like we have two sets of potentials, right? Is that where the story's main thrust resides? So this is I guess here technically would be 24 pages, right? Since we have this double columned. Anyway, guys, if you're just tuning in, thanks for watching. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. If you haven't liked the video yet, please hit like, and we could continue doing these. So, Big Blonde by Dorothy Parker. Hazel Morse was a large, fair woman of the type that incites some men when they use the word blonde to click their tongues and wag their heads roguishly. She prided herself upon her small feet and suffered for her vanity, boxing them in snub-toed, high-heeled slippers of the shortest bearable size. The curious things about her were her hands, strange terminations to the flabby white arms splattered with pale tan spots, long, quivering hands with deep and convex nails. She should not have disfigured them with little jewels. She was not a woman given to recollections. At her middle 30s, her old days were a blurred and flickering sequence, an imperfect film dealing with the actions of strangers. In her 20s, after the deferred death of a hazy widowed mother, she had been employed as a model in a wholesale dress establishment. It was still the day of the big woman, and she was then prettily colored and erect and high-breasted. Her job was not onerous, and she met numbers of men and spent numbers of evenings with them, laughing at their jokes and telling them she loved their neckties. Men liked her, and she took it for granted that the liking of many men was a desirable thing. Popularity seemed to her to be worth all the work that had to be put into its achievement. Men liked you because you were fun, and when they liked you, they took you out, and there you were. So, and successfully, she was fun. She was a good sport. Men like a good sport. No other form of diversion, simpler or more complicated, drew her attention. She never pondered if she might not be better occupied doing something else. Her ideas, or better, her acceptances, ran right along with those of the other substantially built blondes in whom she found her friends. When she had been working in the dress establishment some years, she met Herbie Morse. He was thin, quick, attractive, with shifting lines about his shiny brown eyes and a habit of fiercely biting at the skin around his fingernails. He drank largely. She found that entertaining. Her habitual greeting to him was an allusion to his state of the previous night. "Oh, what a peach you had," she used to say, through her easy laugh. "I thought I'd die, the way you kept asking the waiter to dance with you." She liked him immediately upon their meeting. She was enormously amused at his fast, slurred sentences, his interpolations of apt phrases from vaudeville acts and comic strips. She thrilled at the feel of his lean arm tucked firm beneath the sleeve of her coat. She wanted to touch the wet, flat surface of his hair. He was as promptly drawn to her. They were married 6 weeks after they had met. So before we go any further, let's just talk, because there's already a lot that happened, right? This is a story, so if we imagine regular print pages, maybe 24, 25 pages of print text, and already in about a page and a half, we get tons of characterization, tons of memorable description. So let's just go through a little bit of that. So her name, right, Hazel Morse. I found the name interesting alongside the fact that here we have the deferred death of a hazy widow, right? The repetition of the word. Her life, at that point being a blurred and flickering sequence, right? So, Hazel, hazy, right? This is an observation that's been sort of, made throughout, I guess this was written in 1929. So pretty much for the past century, right? People have been making that observation. Is this a sort of kind of, I think it's called onomastic play, onomastic, is maybe that's the term. When you sort of do things with a character's name, right? That has some significance. So one thing that strikes me about the opening paragraph, though, is the fact that, we know that she works as a model, right? But not she's never called really pretty or beautiful or anything like that, right? We just know that she's a large, fair woman of the type that incites some men. We know that she worked as a model, not, maybe a print model, but she works as a model for some store, right? I don't know exactly what that entails. I'm not sure how, how things were set up then. I'm not sure if they just kind of put her into magazines where they send out oh, this is, what we have this winter. This is what we have this summer, right? Come to our store and, buy our clothes. And she's modeling, I don't know exactly what that looked like, but she's not some sort of big time, well-known model, right? She has enough money to live on, it seems. She has enough money to go out and have a fun time. But she doesn't seem to be A, conventionally beautiful, because that's not ever said, and nobody seems to say that about her. And B, it seems as if the fact that she could be a model working for the store, it's so it is so circumstantial, right? So first of all, being large and fair might work for you, maybe at certain times in American history, but not at every time, right? And she comes up against this disconnect later on in the story, right? She's no longer the desired woman in that regard, at least when it comes to being part of magazine clippings or whatever. And the second part is obviously she is as a woman in this case she's just literally working off of her physical sense, right? Her genetics, her just what she looks like, in the same way that I've made this connection before. Men historically have also had to use their bodies, right? They would go to war. They would be the first ones to die. Usually when it comes to, if you see like intergenerational war with tribes raiding each other across various villages, right? All the men, they get killed oftentimes, and the women are taken in as sex slaves. So bodies, male or female, are used for different purposes throughout history. And this is the way that Dorothy Parker is writing about the use of, women's bodies. But so like when we think about like, like whether or not this is a feminist track, right? Like this paragraph looms large, like before you get anywhere else, right? Clearly something here is like very specific to the fact that she's a woman, obviously. And some of the descriptions, right? She prided herself upon her small feet and suffered for her vanity. And also like this description, like when I say that she's probably not conventionally beautiful, the curious things about her were her hands, strange terminations to the flabby white arms splattered with pale tan spots, right? Like this isn't like very beautiful to me, although of course like in a circumstantial way, depending on like where you are in human history or even like cultures today, there are like, there are places where like culturally people like that skinny fat look. Like my wife often says how like, when it comes to like Korean women, like they would hate to like work out or do anything that's like look masculine. They would not lift weights, for example, right? They would not do kettlebells. I was teaching my in-laws in Korea actually how to do like kettlebell workouts, which is like like it's good, right? But there are people, right, that say like this is and explicitly like they would say like this is too manly for me, right? But sometimes like people like that skinny fat look, right? And it's very possible, I don't know exactly what the context was in 1929, but it's very possible that this look was like tentatively desired, right? So like it's always like like when we talk about like whether, again, going back to like whether or not this is going to be a feminist story, the fact that everything is so tentative, right? The fact that it is so dependent on what's going to be the fad 10 years from now. Like, can you still be a model? You're not conventionally beautiful, but we sort of like your flabbiness here, but maybe it's not going to be in a few years from now. Like everything is so dependent upon what this culture will decide for you in that regard. And of course, right, like this beautiful paragraph, she was not a woman given to recollections. At her middle 30s, her old days were a blurred and flickering sequence, an imperfect film dealing with the actions of strangers. Someone, that develops a drinking problem, someone that kind of like lives life in this kind of tentative way. This is a very believable description and a beautiful description too. This kind of stood out to me in her 20s after the deferred death of a hazy widowed mother. Like what does that mean, right? The deferred death. Is it did Hazel Morse just like kind of expect her mother to die and was kind of like, waiting for this to happen, and it just didn't happen, and she's like, what the fuck? Come on, die already. Was it like a kind of like prolonged suffering that she herself was feeling very, emotional about? Like we don't get any commentary about that, but we do get this word, right? And the fact that this phrase, deferred death, it could tell us a lot, depending on how we choose to interpret it without evidence about Hazel Morse. But the fact that possibility is there, it's open, right? This is a good thing for writing. You want these layers to be there. You want this to act as a kind of puzzle so that, as a character gets sketched out and you go back, you want to be able to say like, oh yeah, like it makes sense that this was seen as a deferred death, right? And also, like, although this is like supposed to be from a kind of third person omniscient, a lot of it is kind of from kind of like the perspective of Hazel Morse herself, right? And you don't exactly know whether this is the narrator, like the meta voice, intruding, or whether this is personally the way that Hazel Morse interpreted the death of her mother. And of course, like the fact that she married this guy within 6 weeks, and it seems like their greatest connection is about like, drinking and going to the club. this might be a problem, right, for the future of this marriage. Anytime you see something like this, right, you should be kind of like a little bit alarmed, right? This is a kind of foreshadowing, but it's also foreshadowing that is just so, it's so indicative though of like very typical, male female relations. Married in 6 weeks, right? This happens often enough. She was delighted at the idea of being a bride, coquetted with, played upon it. Other forms of marriage she had had, other offers of marriage she had had, and not a few of them, but it happened that they were all from stout, serious men who had visited the dress establishment as buyers, men from Des Moines and Houston and Chicago, and in her phrase, even funnier places. There was always something immensely comic to her in the thought of living elsewhere than New York. She could not regard as serious proposals that she share a Western residence, right? So far, not very, doesn't seem to have too much kind of like, going on, intellectually. Like she doesn't seem to be very curious. I think it's also telling, right, that she had other offers of marriage by like stout, serious men, right? She's not into that, right? She does not want stout and serious. She wants to have some fun, or thinks she wants to have some fun. She wanted to be married. She was nearing 30 now, and she did not take the years well. She spread and softened, and her darkening hair turned her to inexpert dabblings with peroxide. There were times when she had little flashes of fear about her job, and she had had a couple of thousand evenings of being a good sport among her male acquaintances. This is a phrase that comes up again and again. She had come to be more conscientious than spontaneous about it. Herbie earned enough, and they took a little apartment far uptown. There was a mission-furnished dining room with a hanging central light globed in liver-colored glass. In the living room were an overstuffed suite, a Boston fern, and a reproduction of the Henner Magdalene with the red hair and the blue draperies. The bedroom was in gray enamel and old rose, with Herbie's photograph on Hazel's dressing table and Hazel's likeness on Herbie's chest of drawers. She cooked, and she was a good cook, and marketed and chatted with the delivery boys and the colored laundress. She loved the flat, she loved her life, she loved Herbie. In the first months of their marriage, she gave him all the passion she was ever to know. She had not realized how tired she was. It was a delight, a new game, a holiday, to give up being a good sport. If her head ached or her arches throbbed, she complained piteously, babishly. If her mood was quiet, she did not talk. If tears came to her eyes, she let them fall. She fell readily into the habit of tears during the first year of marriage. Even in her good sport days, she had been known to weep lavishly and disinterestedly on occasion. Her behavior at the theater was a standing joke. She could weep at anything in a play: tiny garments, love both unrequited and mutual, seduction, purity, faithful servitors, wedlock, the triangle. There goes Hayes, her friends would say, watching her. She's off again. Wedded and relaxed, she poured her tears freely. To her who had laughed so much, crying was delicious. All sorrows became her sorrows. She was tenderness. She would cry long and softly over newspaper accounts of kidnapped babies, deserted wives, unemployed men, strayed cats, heroic dogs. Even when the paper was no longer before her, her mind revolved upon these things, and the drops slipped rhythmically over her plump cheeks. Honestly, she would say to Herbie, all the sadness there is in the world when you stop to think about it. Yeah, Herbie would say. She missed nobody. The old crowd, the people who had brought her and Herbie together, dropped from their lives, lingeringly at first. When she thought of this at all, it was only to consider it fitting. This was marriage. This was peace. But the thing was that Herbie was not amused. For a time, he had enjoyed being alone with her. He found the voluntary isolation novel and sweet. Then it paled with a ferocious suddenness. It was as if one night, sitting with her in the steam-heated living room, he would ask no more, and the next night he was through and done with the whole thing. He became annoyed by her misty melancholies. At first, when he came home to find her softly tired and moody, he kissed her neck and patted her shoulder and begged her to tell her Herbie what was wrong. She loved that. But time slid by, and he found that there was never anything really personally the matter. Ah, for God's sake, he would say, crabbing again. All right, sit there and crab your hat off. I'm going out. And he would slam out of the flat and come back late and drunk. She was completely bewildered by what happened to their marriage. First they were lovers, and then, it seemed without transition, they were enemies. She never understood it. Well, I understand. I've definitely had relationships like that, right? Little by little, you become enemies. You become mutually resentful. And the interesting part here is like, so far, right? Like, I mean, we could like denounce Herbie, right? We could say, like, especially as modern people, well, you know, is there something sort of chemically wrong with this lady? We know that there's, you know, probably something chemically wrong with Dorothy Parker, right? I mean, Dorothy Parker had clear bouts of some kind of depression, right? She had multiple suicide attempts. Some of them might have been not totally serious, but still, like, you know, multiple suicide attempts. So clearly, you know, there was something going on. And this could very well be just a description of a depressed person, right? And we as modern people would say, like, well, you know, this is somebody that needs help, right? Not to just like be made fun of, called a crab, and you know, you leave the house and you leave your wife there and you don't do anything for her after the fact, right? This is piece of shit behavior. That said, I do find it interesting that, you know, throughout, like, the way that this gets presented is she's like sitting around and she's just kind of like almost very indulgently taking upon, you know, other people's sorrows, right? She does not have to feel these sorrows, but for whatever reason she chooses to. And it's one thing, I guess, to want to feel them. I guess it could be like a useful exercise. It could be healthy to do so, for you to like try to really feel what other people feel, right? That might put you into a situation where you're just not so totally self-absorbed. At the same time, this doesn't seem to necessarily go anywhere, right? Like, I would, for example, like, always pass, you know, since coronavirus started, like, I just started walking all the time, since that's kind of like all that you can do. I just walk around all the time, and I would pass by, you know, these various houses with like cat colonies. One cat colony is where I got Cookie from. And I would see these like weathered looking cats, and like I would feel bad, but I would pass by it every day, and it's like, well, I can't just fucking sit here feeling bad about these cats. Like, I'm either gonna like do something about this or not. So I picked up a runty cat, Cookie. She has, you know, multiple problems that have to get fixed by the vet. And also, you know, these cats, like, me and my wife, we walk by and we bring several cans of food, dry food, water, supplements, because some of them clearly look like they have herpes, and cat herpes is seen by how their eyes look. Cause it's like, you know, like what the fuck? You're gonna like crab about it, and you're not gonna like try to do anything at all about it. Like, you're just gonna like bitch and whine. And like she like, this doesn't necessarily get anywhere. Now, I don't think that her marriage could be saved if this would, like, if she has some sort of like, you know, I want to save the world kind of mentality. I don't think her marriage would have turned out well anyway, right? For many other reasons, but she is not presented as necessarily so likable. She's relatable, but she's not so. To me, she's not so likable when I see shit like this. Like, when I see people just crabbing and not wishing to actually do things about, you know, stuff that they claim is kind of like important to them emotionally or otherwise, like, that is an actual flaw, right? In terms of like being a human being, that is an objective flaw that you ought to work on. If you want to improve people's lives, go ahead. If you just want to crab, it's literally all it is it's just self-indulgence, right? This was my initial reading, right? So in terms of like a feminist reading, right? Like, it does make me wonder, like, reading these kinds of paragraphs, like, I do think, like, is this purely is the set of constraints that she feels all because of, you know, this is a male society organized in a kind of way that helps a certain kind of male? Or are her problems also clearly kind of self-created? And I think on some level you could say they are self-created. Like even when she has money, like you never see her try to sort of do anything other than, crab, crab, crab. So clearly we see breaks in their marriage that are only going to get worse from here. Herbie is coming out drunk. She doesn't understand what's going on. Why is this? Why is this? Why is this? There were longer and longer intervals between his leaving his office and his arrival at the apartment. She went through agonies of picturing him run over and bleeding, dead and covered with a sheet. Then she lost her fears for his safety and grew sullen and wounded. When a person wanted to be with a person, he came as soon as possible. She desperately wanted him to want to be with her, her own hours only marked by the time till he would come. It was often nearly 9 o'clock before he came home to dinner. Always he had many drinks, and their effect would die in him, leaving him loud and querulous and bristling for affronts. I've always loved that little phrase, and their effect would die in him, right? So these drinks are supposed to, you're doing it because, I guess temporarily it's supposed to make you happy, lively, whatever. That liveliness would die, right, before you get home, right? So all you get is the after effects. You get, essentially she's fucking crabbing, and he by, imbibing as much as he does to the point of abusing alcohol, he himself, becomes essentially like a kind of crab. So again, back to the feminist reading. Is she a crab? Well, she's clearly crabby here, right? She doesn't do much. This is a self-created problem in some ways, to the degree that we could say this isn't just pure, chemically induced depression. And even if it is chemically induced, by actually, trying to go out and do something about all these nasty things that you see, that would help that. But he's a crab too. I mean, he goes out and he has some fucking fun, and by the time he gets back, he has just that that post drinking haze, right? And he's all fucked up, and he's not pleasant to be around. So he's essentially like her in that regard, which is why they got married. He was too nervous, he said, to sit and do nothing for an evening. He boasted, probably not in all truth, that he had never read a book in his life. What am I expected to do? Sit around this dump on my tail all night? He would ask rhetorically. And again, he would slam out. She did not know what to do. She could not manage him. She could not meet him. She fought him furiously. A terrific domesticity had come upon her, and she would bite and scratch to guard it. And she wanted what she called a nice home. She wanted a sober, tender husband, prompt at dinner, punctual at work. She wanted sweet, comforting evenings. The idea of intimacy with other men was terrible to her. The thought that Herbie might be seeking entertainment in other women set her frantic. It seemed to her that almost everything she read, novels from the drugstore, lending library, magazine stories, women's pages in the papers, dealt with wives who lost their husband's love. She could bear those, at that, better than accounts of neat companionable marriage and living happily ever after. She was frightened. Several times when Herbie came home in the evening, he found her determinedly dressed. She had had to alter those of her clothes that were not new, to make them fasten, and rouged. "Let's go wild tonight. What do you say?" she would hail him. "A person's got lots of time to hang around and do nothing when they're dead." So they would go out to chop houses and the less expensive cabarets, but it turned out badly. She could no longer find amusement in watching Herbie drink. She could not laugh at his whimsicalities. She was so tensely counting his indulgences. And she was unable to keep back her remonstrances. "Oh, come on, Herb, you've had enough, haven't you? You'll feel something terrible in the morning." He would be immediately enraged. All right, crab, 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 that was all she ever did. What a lousy sport she was. There would be scenes, and one or the other of them would rise and stalk out in fury. She could not recall the definite day that she had started drinking herself. There was nothing separate about her days. Like drops upon a window pane, they ran together and trickled away. She had been married 6 months, then a year, then 3 years. And I mean, I don't want to understate, to the extent that this is in fact a feminist text, right? Because, I mean, put yourself into the shoes of a woman, right? So, it's not her fault, right? Like, so Dorothy Parker, she says that, and we know this can't truly be Dorothy Parker, because Dorothy Parker's mind was much kind of more interesting than this woman's. But I mean, Dorothy Parker explicitly, like very much at the beginning, she said that, Hazel Morse just didn't really think about anything else. She didn't imagine that her day could look any different than what her day looks like here, right? She never imagined that she could do anything other than be a model somewhere, and she also never imagined that, hey, all these things that I'm crabbing about and crying about and trying to feel personally, I could actually maybe sort of try to do something for someone. None of that crosses her mind, right? So put yourself in the shoes of a woman that, it's not her fault. Like, she doesn't seem to be like that intelligent, but like, that's not her fault. She's just the way that she is. She had a job, like she looked a certain way. She said, hey, I fit into this niche. They seem to want me to model and it's an easy job, so might as well, right? And now she's married, but she is getting older. At this point, she is like 33 years old, right? Almost. She is like getting soft, right? Do people like I remember like when I used to be like morbidly obese and like constantly ashamed of it and feeling bad about myself. It honestly never really crossed my mind to like, hey, Alex, stop fucking eating, or like, hey, you could actually like start working out. Like, even though like I was like, I was a 19-year-old, 20-year-old, I was, I thought of myself as a smart, I first started like already like reading then. I was trying to become a writer. But like that didn't like knowing that didn't cross my mind. And that as a 20-year-old, I didn't know that I could change my body. I could eat better. There is such a thing as like health in that way. It's hard for me to like, condemn someone that doesn't get it, especially like in 1929. So she's like 33. She's already married. She seems like she's like headed to like some kind of blow up or divorce or something. You're gonna be frightened, right? You can't be a model anymore. You haven't been, and maybe at this point nobody wants you anymore. What are you gonna do if you get divorced? Like, will you be able to find some other kind of job? Will you have to have like a string of suitors that kind of, take care of you, as you become essentially like their concubine? Is that really the life that you want? Are these men going to be even like desirable, or are you going to be just going with them simply because they have some money, right? Because when I did that stream about the red pill guy, Will Nolan, this is the confusion that's often had. Simply having money does not make you sexually attractive to someone that's going to fuck you for like 3 years, right? Or vice versa, right? If you're a woman, right? She has a reason to be frightened in 1929, right? Feeling this way, knowing that this is where her life is heading, and not, clearly not really being intelligent enough to truly get that, to really understand the trajectory that she's setting herself on, whether it's in combination with social constraints or her own bad choices, whatever it might be. So, let's not understate that part. Like, if I were a woman in this situation and I wouldn't know any better, I would also be very, very scared. She had never needed, and also, like, before I forget, let's just, like, spend a moment here to look at this sentence. Like drops upon a window pane, they, meaning her days, ran together and trickled away, right? This is a very nice way of sort of just, giving you a sense of exactly what this must have looked like for an objective observer looking in. She had never needed to drink formally. She could sit for most of the night at a table where the others were imbibing earnestly and never droop in looks or spirits, nor be bored by the doings of those about her. If she took a cocktail, it was so unusual as to cause 20 minutes or so of jocular comment. But now anguish was in her. Frequently after a quarrel, Herbie would stay out for the night, and she could not learn from him where the time had been spent. Her heart felt tight and sore in her breast, and her mind turned like an electric fan. And, like this like little description, like this simile here, if you think of like the various like bric-a-brac, right, in back then, like what electric fans must have looked like or sounded like, just like, an apartment full of these little things. Like, it's this like very, generic thing, but this is how her mind is operating. It's like it's this domestic object, right? That she has kind of, she's come to identify as, the wife. Like, as the wife, this is what I want. I want a certain kind of home, a certain kind of appearance. Right. And so much and so often, right, she's, she wants the thing itself, but if she can't have the thing itself, she's going to have the appearances only. And she's, to the extent that one can be okay with appearances, she settles for those appearances. She hated the taste of liquor. Gin, plain or in mixtures, made her promptly sick. After experiment, she found that Scotch whiskey was best for her. She took it without water because that was the quickest way to its effect. Herbie pressed it on her. He was glad to see her drink. They both felt it might restore her high spirits, and their good times together might again be possible. "Atta girl," he would approve her. "Let's see you get boiled, baby." But it brought them no nearer. When she drank with him, there would be a little while of gaiety, and then strangely, without beginning, they would be in a wild quarrel. They would wake in the morning not sure what it had all been about, foggy as to what had been said and done, but each deeply injured and bitterly resentful. There would be days of vengeful silence. There had been a time when they had made up their quarrels, usually in bed. There would be kisses and little names and assurances of fresh starts. "Oh, it's going to be great now, Herb. We'll have swell times. I was a crab. I guess I must have been tired. But everything's going to be swell. You'll see." Now there were no gentle reconciliations. They resumed friendly relations only in the brief magnanimity caused by liquor, before more liquor drew them into new battles. What a beautiful little phrase, right? They resumed their friendly relations only in the brief magnanimity caused by liquor, right? I mean, you could imagine that, right? This is a very apt description. The scenes became more violent. There were shouted invectives and pushes, and sometimes sharp slaps. Once she had a black eye. Herbie was horrified next day at sight of it. He did not go to work. He followed her about, suggesting remedies and heaping dark blame on himself. But after they had a few drinks to pull themselves together, she made so many wistful references to her bruise that he shouted at her and rushed out and was gone for 2 days. Each time he left the place in a rage. And also just like to, make this clear, right? So, obviously, a feminist would say like, oh, what a obviously, patriarchal piece of shit, domestic violence, blah, blah. I mean, all that is true, right? And just like she doesn't quite understand what's happening to her in her life, he doesn't understand what he's doing either, right? So like, he's like shocked at himself that he could beat his wife. And he's like walking around and he's like following her and trying to like make it better. Right. But then, of course, like he can't control himself. Like he's a very, very flawed person, obviously. He goes into the drink and he just, escapes the house. Right. That's like the perfect excuse. Right. Because when she starts bringing up like these wistful references, and that's also kind of beautiful. Right. Think about it being a wistful reference to your bruise. Like, just imagine like what might have that looked like? Like, oh, Herbie, like, if only this didn't happen, like maybe we could go out tonight. Like maybe it was like something like that. Maybe that got him upset, and he didn't understand enough about life or about himself or about right and wrong, essentially, to know that this was bad, that he did a bad thing, and this is not the place for him to be getting upset, right? Simply because she's kind of, and her being to the extent that she's wistful about these references to her bruise, like she's also not quite getting that, to talk about this wistfully it's just not appropriate, right? Like something really bad happened to you and there needs to be, amends of some sort. Like this isn't the place to say like, oh, if only, right? This is the place essentially for punishment, right? Especially if you can't get any true reconciliation. Each time he left the place in a rage. So basically, I just said that just to make sure that people know that, just like from a feminist reading, we could say that Hazel Morse doesn't really understand herself or her place in society. Herbie does not understand himself, his place, what life is about. He doesn't seem to want to understand it. He's just, he's in some ways as empty as she is, except, he has the added bonus, I guess, of being also objectively a worse person, right? Each time he left the place in a rage, he threatened never to come back. She did not believe him, nor did she consider separation. Somewhere in her head or heart was the lazy, nebulous hope that things would change and she and Herbie settled suddenly into soothing married life. Here were her home, her furniture, her husband, her station. She summoned no alternatives. She could no longer bustle and potter. She had no more vicarious tears. The hot drops she shed were for herself. She walked ceaselessly about the rooms, her thoughts running mechanically round and round Herbie. In those days began the hatred of being alone that she was never to overcome. You could be by yourself when things were all right, but when you were blue, you got the howling horrors. And you wonder to what extent does this apply to Dorothy Parker, right? Like, she would always be sort of out on the town, right? She was always she was like a society girl in some ways. And I mean, like, she knew that it was bullshit and she hated it, but she did it anyway, right? And why did she have to do it? Well, maybe it was the howling horrors. She commenced drinking alone, little, short drinks all through the day. It was only with Herbie that alcohol made her nervous and quick in offense. Alone, it blurred sharp things for her. She lived in a haze of it. Her life took on a dreamlike quality. Nothing was astonishing. A Mrs. Martin moved into the flat across the hall. She was a great blonde woman of 40, a promise and looks of what Mrs. Morse was to be. They made acquaintance, quickly became inseparable. Mrs. Morse spent her days in the opposite apartment. They drank together to brace themselves after the drinks of the nights before. She never confided her troubles about Herbie to Mrs. Martin. The subject was too bewildering to her to find comfort in talk. She let it be assumed that her husband's business kept him much away. It was not regarded as important. Husbands, as such, played but shadowy parts in Mrs. Martin's circle. Mrs. Martin had no visible spouse. You were left to decide for yourself whether he was or was not dead. She had an admirer, Joe, who came to see her almost nightly. Often he brought several friends with him. The boys, they were called. The boys were big, red, good-humored men, perhaps 45, perhaps 50. Mrs. Morse was glad of invitations to join the parties. Herbie was scarcely ever at home at night now. If he did come home, she did not visit Mrs. Martin. An evening alone with Herbie meant inevitably a quarrel, yet she would stay with him. There was always her thin and wordless idea that maybe this night things would begin to be all right. The boys brought plenty of liquor along with them whenever they came to Mrs. Martin's. Drinking with them, Mrs. Morse became lively and good-natured and audacious. She was quickly popular. When she had drunk enough to cloud her most recent battle with Herbie, she was excited by their approbation. Crab was she? Rotten sport was she? Well, there were some that thought different. The interesting thing here is that she's called like lively, right? She's called someone that is like a good sport, is good fun, but we never actually see examples of like, well, why is she popular? Why do men like her? Like, if she were to get good-natured and audacious, what exactly would she be doing? Wouldn't get much of that because I think the idea for the story is, on some level, it doesn't really matter. Everything that she does under the influence of drink or not, it seems to be that this veneer, right? So again, going back to, whether or not we could do like a feminist critique of the story, none of that really matters because it's not truly what she feels and what she is, right? She wants to be at home. She wants to be married. She wants to be normal. She wants to have like, a husband that comes home and treats her well. And, she wants to also, to her lack of credit, I guess, be allowed to be like self-indulgent in her tears, right? Without also being asked, right, to try to do anything about anything, right? She wants to go back to this, but we never really get to see the fun, right? Because that fun is not her, right? All throughout the text, right? This is a short story, but it's a longer short story. But all throughout the text, like little by little, we just get like a stack, layer of characterization. So this was actually a very good choice on the part of Dorothy Parker, right? To just like say, You know what? I'm not going to show you that side of Hazel Morse that she wants to show to other people all the time and wants to be perceived as, right? I'm going to show you who she truly is. I'm just going to tell you about those other sides. Ed was one of the boys. He lived in Utica, had his own business there, was the odd report, but he came to New York almost every week. He was married. He showed Mrs. Morse the then current photographs of Junior and Sister, and she praised them abundantly and sincerely. Soon it was accepted by the others that Ed was her particular friend. He staked her when they all played poker. He sat next to her and occasionally rubbed his knee against hers during the game. She was rather lucky. Frequently, she went home with a $20 bill or a $10 bill or a handful of crumpled dollars. She was glad of them. Herbie was getting, in her words, something awful about money. To ask him for it brought an instant row. "What the hell do you do with it?" he would say. "Shoot it all in scotch?" "I try to run this house halfway decent," she would retort. "Never thought of that, did you?" "Oh no, his lordship couldn't be bothered with that." Again, she could not find a definite day to fix the beginning of Ed's proprietorship. It became his custom to kiss her on the mouth when he came in, as well as for farewell, and he gave her little quick kisses of approval all through the evening. She liked this rather more than she disliked it. She never thought of his kisses when she was not with him. He would run his hand lingeringly over her back and shoulders. "Some dizzy blonde, eh?" he would say. "Some doll." One afternoon she came home from Mrs. Martin's to find Herbie in the bedroom. He had been away for several nights, evidently in a prolonged drinking bout. His face was gray, his hands jerked as if they were on wires. On the bed were 2 old suitcases packed high. Only her photograph remained in his bureau, and the wide doors of his closet disclosed nothing but coat hangers. "I'm blowing," he said. "I'm through with the whole works. I got a job in Detroit." She sat down at the edge of the bed. She had drunk much the night before, and the 4 scotches she had had with Mrs. Martin had only increased her fogginess. "Good job," she said. "Oh yeah," he said. "Looks all right." He closed the suitcase with difficulty, swearing at it in whispers. "There's some dough in the bank," he said. "The bank book's in your top drawer. You can have the furniture and stuff." He looked at her, and his forehead twitched. "God damn it, I'm through. I'm telling you," he cried. "I'm through." All right, she said. "I heard you, didn't I?" She saw him as if he were at one end of a cannon and she at the other. Her head was beginning to ache bumpingly, and her voice had a dreary, tiresome tone. She could not have raised it. "Like a drink before you go?" she asked. Again he looked at her, and a corner of his mouth jerked up. "Cockeyed again for a change, aren't you?" he said. "That's nice. Sure, get a couple of shots, will you?" She went to the pantry, mixed him a stiff highball, poured herself a couple of inches of whiskey and drank it. Then she gave herself another portion and brought the glasses into the bedroom. He had strapped both suitcases and had put on his hat and overcoat. He took his highball. "Well," he said, and he gave a sudden uncertain laugh. "Here's mud in your eye." "Mud in your eye," she said. They drank. He put down his glass and took up the heavy suitcase. "Got to get a train around 6, he said. She followed him down the hall. There was a song that Mrs. Martin played doggedly on the phonograph, running loudly through her mind. She had never liked the thing. "Night and daytime, always playtime. Ain't we having fun?" Oh, sorry, I misread the whole thing. Night and daytime, always playtime. Night and daytime, always playtime. Ain't we got fun? At the door he put down the bags and faced her. "Well," he said. "Well, take care of yourself. You'll be all right, will you?" "Oh, sure," she said. He opened the door, then came back to her, holding out his hand. "Bye, Hayes," he said. "Good luck to you." She took his hand and shook it. "Pardon my wet glove," she said. When the door had closed behind him, she went back to the pantry. She was flushed and lively when she went into Mrs. Martin's that evening. The boys were there, Ed among them. He was glad to be in town, frisky and loud and full of jokes. But she spoke quietly to him for a minute. "Herbie blue today," she said. "Going to live out west." "That's so," he said. He looked at her and played with the fountain pen clipped to his waistcoat pocket. Think he's gone for good, do you? He asked. Yeah, she said. I know he is. I know. Yeah. You're going to live across the hall just the same, he said. Know what you're going to do? Gee, I don't know, she said. I don't give much of a damn. Oh, come on, that's no way to talk, he told her. What do you need? You need a little snifter. Well, how about it? Yeah, she said, just straight. She won $43 at poker. When the game broke up, Ed took her back to her apartment. Got a little kiss from me, he asked. He wrapped her in his big arms and kissed her violently. She was entirely passive. He held her away and looked at her. Little tight, honey, he asked anxiously. Not going to be sick, are you? Me, she said. I'm swell. All right, so she's still kind of, trying to be that good sport. So one thing that struck me here when I was first reading it was, when he's leaving, right, which is the thing that she doesn't want to happen, right? She's saying that she does not want a separation. She's not like, she's not doing like the stereotypical, caricatured female character thing. Like she's not like throwing herself at his feet. She's not doing any of that. Like to some extent, like she's obviously dulled by the alcohol, right? But, it's obviously like a really good choice, right? On Dorothy Parker's part to, not go for the most kind of cliched way to close this out. But again, going back to, can we have a truly feminist reading here, or is this all self-inflicted? Look at what happens between these two, right? So, Ed is just like, he's like playing with his fountain pen, right? He's not at all like, oh shit, like that's your husband and he left you. Like what about, well, like his first thought is like, how can I, get laid with her? Maybe that already happened to this point. Who knows? How can I, essentially he turns her into a concubine. How can I have her for myself in this way? So like absolutely no empathy. And, she knows this, she understands this, like she knows that this is, as far as like, being smart or not smart, we know that she's smart enough to just understand that, right? Like that this man does, to the extent that he has your interests in his head, it's gonna look like, get an apartment, you're gonna be my mistress here, and I'm gonna pay you money essentially, right? So, like very, very, very fucking sad scene, right? Let me actually take that. That was a long kind of a little beginning, so let's see if there's any comments here for me to take. Nice cat. Dan and Jess approved, of course. Why wouldn't they? Beautiful cat, sweet cat, great cat. Again, guys, if you're watching, anybody new here, thanks for watching. Please hit like, please subscribe. Thank you. Let's just keep rolling through the story. We're almost halfway done. And just like structurally, right? Like, so just knowing that we're almost halfway done, we're on page 6, a little bit through page 6. And just like structurally, like just keep in mind how much compressed, right? Dark humor, how much compressed characterization we had just in those, few pages. And now we're going to get, more individual parts, right? I think the whole thing is 4 or 5 parts. Now they're going to start piling up. Like, just like you imagine a kind of, a desperate woman, let's say, in the 20s, like not knowing what to do next. These problems and all these things and this kind of haze, right? This haze of drunkenness and not knowing what to do next. All that starts piling up and structurally, right? We get part 2, part 3, part 4, maybe part 5. You're just all kind of like smashed together. Kind of like you can imagine in an accordion, right? We start here, right? And this is now how we're gonna end up, right? We're gonna see her kind of like completely pulled apart, her as a character. When Ed left in the morning, he took her photograph with him. He said he wanted her picture to look at up in Utica. You can have that one in the bureau, she said. She put Herbie's picture in a drawer out of her sight. When she could look at it, She meant to tear it up. She was fairly successful in keeping her mind from racing around him. Whiskey slowed it for her. She was almost peaceful in her midst. She accepted her relationship with Ed without question or enthusiasm. When he was away, she seldom thought definitely of him. He was good to her. He gave her frequent presents and a regular allowance. She was even able to save. She did not plan ahead of any day, but her wants were few, and you might as well put money in the bank as have it lying around. When the lease of her apartment neared its end, it was Ed who suggested moving. His friendship with Mrs. Martin and Joe had become strained over a dispute at poker. A feud was impending. "Let's get the hell out of here," Ed said. "What I want you to have is a place near the Grand Central. Make it easier for me." So she took a little flat in the 40s. A colored maid came in every day to clean and make coffee for her. She was through with that housekeeping stuff, she said. And Ed, 20 years married to a passionately domestic woman, admired this romantic uselessness and felt doubly a man of the world in abetting it. So obviously, right, at this point, she becomes a kind of, a de facto prostitute. I don't think she has any kind of job in the rest of this story. So let's just keep in mind how, just put yourself in the shoes of a woman in the 20s, right? Even if you're a guy that believes men have it so much worse, even if that's true, you still have to have some level of empathy, and you still have to be able to understand in which ways maybe your life is better or worse than someone else's. And in terms of being a woman here, just look at how kind of almost imperceptibly she falls into this situation where she becomes a prostitute, right? She becomes the concubine of this guy that she doesn't even seem to really care about, because before this separation, she says hey, whenever I'm with Ed, I have fun, but when I'm not around Ed, if I'm with Herbie, I never think about Ed, right? So it's not like she's even into this at all. This is very much a kind of financial transaction here, right? And again, for every guy that says women have it so much better throughout all of history, even if that's true, honestly, if you have the choice to have the life of Herbie Morse or Hazel Morse, I think most men would say, yeah, I don't want to prostitute myself in this way. So let's always keep that in mind. The coffee was all she had until she went out to dinner, but alcohol kept her fat. Prohibition she regarded only as a basis for jokes. You could always get all you wanted. She was never noticeably drunk and seldom nearly sober. It required a larger daily allowance to keep her misty-minded. Too little, and she was achingly melancholy. Ed brought her to Jimmy's. He was proud, with the pride of the transient who would be mistaken for a native, and his knowledge of small, recent restaurants occupying the lower floors of shabby brownstone houses. Places where, upon mentioning the name of a, I forget how that word is pronounced, but basically, is it habitué? A person that frequents a certain place, or a person frequently, would be a habitué of that friend or place or person or whatever. Might be obtained strange whiskey and fresh gin and many of their ramifications. Jimmy's place was the favorite of his acquaintances. Don't ask me guys to pronounce words. I don't talk to people, right? I just read stuff, so I never know how to pronounce anything. There, through Ed, Mrs. Morse met many men and women, formed quick friendships. The men often took her out when Ed was in Utica. He was proud of her popularity. She fell into the habit of going to Jimmy's alone when she had no engagement. She was certain to meet some people she knew and joined them. It was a club for her friends, both men and women. The women at Jimmy's looked remarkably alike, and this was curious The women at Jimmy's looked remarkably alike, and this was curious, for through feuds, removals, and opportunities of more profitable contacts, the personnel of the group changed constantly. Yet always the newcomers resembled those whom they replaced, right? Imagine this kind of dream scenario, right? This kind of revolving door of completely replaceable faces. Yet always the newcomers resembled those whom they replaced. They were all big women and stout, broad of shoulder and abundantly breasted, with faces thickly clothed in soft, high-colored flesh. They laughed loud and often, showing opaque and lustreless teeth like squares of crockery. There was about them the health of the big, yet a slight unwholesome suggestion of stubborn preservation. They might have been 36 or 45 or anywhere in between. All right, let's just think about this description, right? And like to what extent, is Hazel's life like the life of these women, right? They were all big and stout, broad of shoulder, right? These are like women that, like her, seem to be like the leftovers of a time when you could easily, perhaps make money as this kind of woman, this kind of model, right? Abundantly breasted, right? Faces thickly clothed in soft, high-colored flesh. Right, laughed loud and often over what, right? We know there's nothing actually worthwhile going on, right? This is all fucking appearances. We never get any specific jokes. We never get these instances of what the drinking looks like because it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter to Hazel. It doesn't matter to, anybody that's here, except maybe, some of the men that are having fun. And some of the women that are having fun, and perhaps some women are legitimately getting something good out of it, right? But also, like, the reality is like, perhaps unless you're a certain kind of woman, all right, the ease, with which you could live life could easily be overstated. They compose their titles, just like for men, right? Unless you're a certain kind of man, the ease of your life is also going to be very different, right? If you're a man that's 5'2", and you're unattractive, and you're not smart, and you have no money, and you're habitually exploited, right? Your life is gonna fucking suck. You're not even gonna be able to have a mistress, right? Right. Even if you're not totally attracted to like a woman of like the type or whatever of Hazel Morse, right? You probably won't even be able to get a mistress, right? So. Like I just like as I'm reading this, like I just want to see like there's like this dynamic dance, right, between a feminist critique and other kinds of critiques and the characters, right, like they are dynamic, right, and the relationships are fluid, and these are all things that you have to think about. They composed their titles of their own first names with their husband's surnames: Mrs. Florence Miller, Mrs. Vera Riley, Mrs. Lillian Block. This gave, at the same time, the solidity of marriage and the glamour of freedom. Yet only one or two were actually divorced. Most of them never referred to their dimmed spouses. Some, a shorter time separate, described them in terms of great biological interest, right? Describe them in terms of great biological interest. That kind of like almost, what's a term that I would use? It's like almost like a, medical term almost. Several were mothers, each of an only child, a boy at school somewhere or a girl being cared for by a grandmother. Often, well on towards morning, there would be displays of Kodak portraits and of tears. They were comfortable women, cordial and friendly and irrepressibly matronly. Theirs was the quality of ease. Become fatalistic, especially about money matters, they were unworried. Whenever their funds dropped alarmingly, a new donor appeared. This had always happened. The aim of each was to have one man permanently to pay all her bills, in return for which she would have immediately given up on other admirers and probably would have become exceedingly fond of him, for the affections of all of them were by now unexacting, tranquil, and easily arranged. This end, however, grew increasingly difficult yearly. Mrs. Morse was regarded as fortunate. All right, so again, like just think about it just psychologically, right? What is happening here, right? And the fact that, again, as a man, imagining this doesn't seem all that bad, right? But from a psychological perspective, like if you're a woman going through this, like you being more protective of your sex, this is not a very comfortable position to be in, right? I know guys always have that, have that fantasy, like, oh, if I could be like a fucking porn star, right? Like I would have a great life. Right, but your mentality is just baseline going to be different, right? How willing you are to part essentially with your sexuality and give it up, as it were. It's gonna feel different. It's gonna look different. Okay, so always remember that. Ed had a good year, increased her allowance, and gave her a sealskin coat. But she had to be careful of her moods with him. He insisted upon gaiety. He would not listen to admissions of aches or weariness. Right? And we know that so far, right? Because he seems to be like completely unconcerned with her as a person. Hey, listen, he would say, I got worries of my own and plenty. Nobody wants to hear other people's troubles, sweetie. What you got to do, you got to be a sport and forget it, see? Well, slip us a little smile then. That's my girl. Right? So this is kind of like a slightly kinder version of what Herbie would do. She never had enough interest to quarrel with him as she had with Herbie, but she wanted the privilege of occasional admitted sadness. It was strange. The other women she saw did not have to fight their moods. There was Mrs. Florence Miller, who got regular crying jags, and the men sought only to cheer and comfort her. The others spent whole evenings in grieved recitals of worries and ills. Their escorts paid them deep sympathy. But she was instantly undesirable when she was low in spirits. Once, at Jimmy's, when she could not make herself lively, Ed had walked out and left her. Why the hell don't you stay home and not go spoiling everybody's evening, he had roared. Even her slightest acquaintances seemed irritated if she was not conspicuously lighthearted. What's the matter with you anyway, they would say. Be your age, why don't you? Have a little drink and snap out of it. By the way, guys, this is why doing something like, and I mean, you see this like as a stereotype, right? Like a girl walking down the street, some guy cat calls her, she's not interested in this guy, and he would say some shit like, smile more, smile, like, why you look so sad? Like just don't fucking do it. Like, it happened to me before, like some guy, he was like trying to give me something, and I just like passed by him, and he was like, smile more, and I got really fucking pissed. The last thing that anyone wants to hear is like somebody trying to control your fucking emotions, right? Like smiling on command. And men generally don't have to deal with smile more, right? Like, you don't have to smile more. You could do whatever you want to do. You could look however you want to look. The stakes of your physical appearance are much lower for a male than it is for a woman. But here, like just imagine this, being in the situation where like your livelihood essentially at this point depends on looking happy and just looking like a fucking don't do that, guys, if you ever are in a position to try to talk to a stranger on the street, which I don't do either, which is why I've always met women on the internet, right? I don't have to come up to anyone, and I could always put my best foot forward, right? Because I am a verbal wit, and I could always put my best foot forward. What's the matter with you anyway, they would say. Be your age, why don't you? Have a little drink and snap out of it. When her relationship with Ed had continued nearly 3 years, he moved to Florida to live. He hated leaving her. He gave her a large check and some shares of a sound stock, and his pale eyes were wet when he said goodbye. She did not miss him. He came to New York infrequently, perhaps 2 or 3 times a year, and hurried directly from the train to see her. She was always pleased to have him come and never sorry to see him go. I just love that. Like, he gave her some preferred stock, and was it like, what did it say, shares or a share? Where was I? And some shares of a sound stock, right? And by the way, she wouldn't know this, right? But this was, what was I forget what the month was of the ninth, because the crash was in 1929. I don't know if the story was written after it, but it makes it like even more kind of wistful, right? Some shares of a sound stock that probably went to zero. I think the 1929 crash was, what was the S&P? It was something like 25 points. And it crashed down to 5. So like, imagine the biggest crashes, we shave off something like 50% these days, because life is a lot more stable now. It's essentially a fucking shit coin, right? It goes, we go down 80-90%, which is, it's such a male thing too, right? I'm gonna give you this thing. They're like, look, I was such a genius, like buying the stock during the middle of like an unprecedented bull market, right? Here, you could have, right, out of my generosity, right? His pale eyes were wet when he said goodbye. So, he has some emotion, but the fact is, it's like, it's not good enough, right? Having some emotional connection to this woman is not good enough. You're not leaving your wife, right? You're not doing anything other than just like, oh man, like I wish I could like, have this arrangement some more, right? I've enjoyed myself. Charlie, an acquaintance of Ed's that she had met at Jimmy's, had long admired her. He had always made opportunities of touching her and leaning close to talk to her. He asked repeatedly of all their friends if they had ever heard such a fine laugh as she had. After Ed left, Charlie became the main figure in her life. She classified him and spoke of him as not so bad. There was nearly a year of Charlie. Then she divided her time between him and Sydney, another frequenter of Jimmy's. Then Charlie slipped away altogether. So here, like I said, we're going to have this structurally, like, the layers are going to come up. We're going to have part 2, 3, 4, whatever. Here, the lovers are coming up because, we had like some descriptions of Herbie. Then we have even fewer descriptions of Ed. I mean, we pretty much know nothing about Ed except he seems to be a little bit kinder than Herbie. He seems to at least have like some emotional response to, having to leave her, to the extent that he's just like, cheating on his wife and like, kind of, living a lie. I don't want to overstate his goodness or anything like that, but we have like some description of Ed a little bit, but now we're not going to get even that, right? We're just going to get these interchangeable men. And again, put yourself into the shoes of a woman, right? Don't think of yourself like, fuck it, like I could have interchangeable women and I could have woman after woman. I could just fuck each of them and I don't care. Why should she care, right? It doesn't work like that in reverse, right? Especially when her biggest desire, right? She wants to be not a kept woman, right? She does not want to be a fucking concubine for someone. She does not even want to be a concubine for a king, right? She wants to be, if she could just have Herbie in a little apartment somewhere far uptown and never leave the house again, she would have that if she could. Sydney was a little, brightly dressed, clever Jew. She was perhaps nearest contentment with him. He amused her always. Her laughter was not forced. He admired her completely. Her softness and size delighted him, and he thought she was great, he often told her, because she kept gay and lively when she was drunk. Once I had a gal, he said, used to try and throw herself out of the window every time she got a can on. Jesus, he added feelingly. Then Sydney married a rich and watchful bride, and then there was Billy. No, after Sydney came Ferd, then Billy. In her haste, she never recalled how men entered her life and left it. There were no surprises. She had no thrill at their advent, nor woe at their departure. She seemed to be always able to attract men. There was never another as rich as Ed, but they were all generous to her in their means. Once she had news of Herbie. She met Mrs. Martin dining at Jimmy's, and the old friendship was vigorously renewed. The still admiring Joe, while on a business trip, had seen Herbie. He had settled in Chicago. He looked fine. He was living with some woman, seemed to be crazy about her. Mrs. Morse had been drinking vastly that day. She took the news with mild interest, as one hearing of the sex peccadilloes of some body whose name is, after a moment's groping, familiar. Must be damn near 7 years since I saw him, she commented. Gee, 7 years. That means that she must be about 40 now, right? Because they're about 33 when they separated. More and more, her days lost their individuality. She never knew dates, nor was sure of the day of the week. My God, was that a year ago, she would exclaim when an event was recalled in conversation. She was tired so much of the time, tired and blue. Almost everything could give her the blues. Those old horses she saw on 6th Avenue, struggling and slipping along the cart tracks, or standing at the curb, their heads dropped level with their worn knees. The tightly stored tears would squeeze from her eyes as she teetered past on her aching feet in the stubby, champagne-colored slippers. I mean, she's kind of like, in a sense, like this horse, right? She's like, she was saying that at some point, like her tears, right, were no longer for others, right? They were only for herself. These tears for the horses, right, they're also for herself at this point. She is like this like workhorse. The thought of death came and stayed with her and lent her a sort of drowsy cheer. It would be nice and restful to be dead. She was no settled, shocked moment when she, There was no settled, shocked moment when she first thought of killing herself. It seemed to her as if the idea had always been with her. She pounced upon all the accounts of suicides in the newspapers. There was an epidemic of self-killings, or maybe it was just that she searched for the stories of them so eagerly that she found many. To read of them roused reassurance in her. She felt a cozy solidarity with the big company of the voluntary dead. She slept, aided by whiskey, till deep into the afternoons, then lay abed, a bottle and glass at her hand, until it was time to dress to go out for dinner. She was beginning to feel towards alcohol a little puzzled distrust, as toward an old friend who has refused a simple favor. Whiskey could still soothe her for the most of the time, but there were sudden, inexplicable moments when the cloud fell treacherously away from her, and she was sawn by the sorrow and bewilderment and nuisance of all living. She played voluptuously with the thought of cool, sleepy retreat. She had never been troubled by religious belief, and no vision of an afterlife intimidated her. She dreamed by day of never again putting on tight shoes, of never having to laugh and listen and admire, of never more being a good sport. Never, right? So essentially, she just no longer wants to feel, being a woman of a specific kind of, sort. But how would you do it? It made her sick to think of jumping from heights. She could not stand a gun. At the theater, if one of the actors drew a revolver, she crammed her fingers into her ears and could not even look at the stage until after the shot had been fired. There was no gas in her flat. She looked long at the bright blue veins in her slim wrists. A cut with a razor blade, and there you'd be. But it would hurt, and hurt like hell, and there would be blood to see. Poison. Something tasteless and quick and painless was the thing. But they wouldn't sell it to you in drugstores because of the law. She had few other thoughts. There was a new man now, Art. He was short and fat and exacting, and hard on her patience when he was drunk. But there had only been occasionals for some time before him, and she was glad of a little stability. 2, Art must be away for weeks at a stretch selling silks, and that was restful. She was convincingly gay with him, though the effort shook her viciously. The best sport in the world, he would murmur deep in her neck, the best sport in the world. One night, when he had taken her to Jimmy's, she went into the dressing room with Mrs. Florence Miller. There, while designing curly mouths on their faces with lip rouge, they compared experiences of insomnia. Honestly, Mrs. Morse said, I wouldn't close an eye if I didn't go to bed full of scotch. I lie there and toss and turn and toss and turn. Blue. Does a person get blue lying away that way? Say, listen, Hazel, Mrs. Miller said impressively. I'm telling you, I'd be awake for a year if I didn't take Veronal. That stuff makes you sleep like a fool. So these are like this was the brand name of the various benzos or whatever. Technically, what are they? Like the barbiturates. They were popular at the time. Very powerful and also kind of easy to overdose on. Isn't it poison or something? Mrs. Morse asked. Oh, you take too much and you're out for the count, said Mrs. Miller. I just take 5 grains. They come in tablets. I'd be scared to fool around with it, but 5 grains and you cork off pretty. Can you get it anywhere? Mrs. Morse felt superbly Machiavellian. Get all you want in Jersey, said Mrs. Miller. They won't give it to you, and they won't give it to you here without you have a doctor's prescription. Finished? We'd better go back to and see what the boys are doing. That night, Art left Mrs. Morse at the door of her apartment. His mother was in town. Mrs. Morse was still sober, and it happened that there was no whiskey left in her cupboard. She lay in bed looking up at the black ceiling. She rose early for her and went to New Jersey. She had never taken the tube and did not understand it. So she went to the Pennsylvania station and bought a railroad ticket to Newark. She thought of nothing in particular on the trip out. She looked at the uninspired hats of the women about her and gazed through the smeared window at the flat, gritty scene. In Newark, in the first drugstore she came to, she asked for a tin of talcum powder, a nail brush, and a box of Veronal tablets. The powder and the brush were to make the hypnotic seem also a casual need. The clerk was entirely unconcerned. We only keep them in bottles, he said, and wrapped it up for her in a little glass vial containing 10 white tablets, stacked one on another. She went to another drugstore and bought a face cloth, an orange wood stick, and a bottle of Veronal tablets. The clerk was also uninterested. Well, I guess I got enough to kill an ox, she thought, and went back to the station. At home, she put the little vials in the drawer of her dressing table and stood looking at them with a dreamy tenderness. There they are, God bless them, she said, and she kissed her fingertip and touched each bottle. So we get before the suicide attempt. So like so far, like what we hear about this, her desire to die, like trying to figure out what is the best way to commit suicide. Dorothy Parker herself, right? She had several suicide attempts, and one of the ways was like she would go. I'm not sure if this became kind of like she was like a pill popper or if this was just like one suicide attempt, but she would actually go do the same thing. Right? She would go to New Jersey and she would buy like multiple things at once so that people wouldn't get suspicious. And, she would, get tons of these pills. She actually has a poem about like suicide attempts. I can't really find it right now. Anyway, she just goes through like a bunch of like potential ways to kill yourself, and all of them are like not good. All of them are just kind of like, here, resume is the name of the poem. Razors pain you, rivers are damp, acids stain you, and drugs cause cramp. Guns aren't lawful, nooses give, gas smells awful, you might as well live. Right, which ultimately was Dorothy Parker's decision, right, to ultimately live, although perhaps not, at her best. Okay, so here she has this bottle. The colored maid was busy in the living room. So keep in mind, right, we hear about this colored maid, right? She had a colored maid earlier on with Herbie, I think. And now, or maybe with someone else. Yeah, no, not with Herbie. With the other guy, Ed. And now we get this again, like, and we don't get her name, right? This is like almost like a functional, a character thus far, right? Although it doesn't happen, right? Wait, how did I get here? Okay, so finally we get her name. Hey, Nettie, Mrs. Morse called. Be an angel, will you? Run around to Jimmy's and get me a quart of scotch. She hummed while she awaited the girl's return. During the next few days, whiskey ministered to her as tenderly as it had done when she first turned to its aid. Alone, she was soothed and vague. At Jimmy's, she was the gayest of the groups. Art was delighted with her. Then one night, she had an appointment to meet Art at Jimmy's for an early dinner. He was to leave afterward on a business excursion, to be away for a week. Mrs. Morse had been drinking all the afternoon. While she dressed to go out, she felt herself rising pleasurably from drowsiness to high spirits. But as she came out into the street, the effects of the whiskey deserted her completely, and she was filled with a slow, grinding wretchedness so horrible that she stood swaying on the pavement, unable for a moment to move forward. It was a gray night with spurts of mean, thin snow, and the streets shone with dark ice. As she slowly crossed 6th Avenue, consciously dragging one foot past the other, a big, scarred horse pulling a rickety express wagon crashed to his knees before her. The driver swore and screamed and lashed the beast insanely, bringing the whip back over his shoulder for every blow, while the horse struggled to get a footing on the slippery asphalt. A group gathered and watched with interest. All right, like this is, like she's being, metaphorically whipped, right, furiously, right, insanely, all right, as she struggles to get a footing on the slippery, in this case, her slippery life. Art was waiting when Mrs. Morse reached Jimmy's. "What's the matter with you, for God's sake?" was his greeting to her. "I saw a horse," she said. "Gee, a person feels sorry for horses." It isn't just horses. Everything's kind of terrible, isn't it? I can't help getting drunk. I can't help getting sunk. Sunk, me eye, he said. "What's the idea of all the belly aching? What have you got to be sunk about?" "I can't help it," she said. Help it, me eye, she said. "Pull yourself together, will you? Come on and sit down and take that face off of you." She drank industriously, and she tried hard, but she could not overcome her her melancholy. Wait, where are we? This is, okay. Others joined them and commented on her gloom, and she could do no more for them than smile weakly. She made little dabs at her eyes with her handkerchief, trying to time her movements so they would get unnoticed, but several times Art caught her and scowled and shifted impatiently in his chair. When it was time for him to go to his train, she said she would leave too and go home. And not a bad idea either, he said. See if you can't sleep yourself out of it. I'll see you Thursday. For God's sake, try and cheer up by then, will you? Yeah, she said, I will. In her bedroom, she dressed with a tense speed wholly unlike her usual slow uncertainty. She put on her nightgown, took off her hairnet, and passed the comb quickly through her dry, vari-colored hair. Then she took the 2 little vials from the drawer and carried them into the bathroom. The splintering misery had gone from her, and she felt the quick excitement of one who is about to receive an anticipated gift. She uncorked the vials, filled the glass with water, and stood before the mirror, a tablet between her fingers. Suddenly she bowed graciously to her reflection and raised the glass to it. Well, here's mud in your eye, she said. The tablets were unpleasant to take, dry and powdery and sticking obstinately halfway down her throat. It took her a long time to swallow all 20 of them. She stood watching her reflection with deep, impersonal interest, studying the movements of the gulping throat. Once more, she spoke aloud to it. Right, and that's a nice little touch, right? Like the thing with Herbie, right? They don't really say this anymore now, right? But when people would take drinks, right, when a toast is finished, here's mud in your eye, right? She, finished, I guess, this toast. For God's sake, try and cheer up by Thursday, will you? She said. Well, you know what he can do. He and the whole lot of them. She had no idea how quickly to expect effect from the Veronal. When she had taken the last tablet, she stood uncertainly, wondering, still with a courteous, vicarious interest, if death would strike her down then and there. She felt in no way strange, save for a slight stirring of sickness from the effort of swallowing the tablets. Nor did her reflected face look at all different. It would not be immediate then. It might even take an hour or so. She stretched her arms high and gave a vast yawn. Guess I'll go to bed, she said. Gee, I'm nearly dead. That struck her as comic, and she turned out of the bathroom light and went in and laid herself down in her bed, chuckling softly all the time. Gee, I'm nearly dead, she quoted. That's a hot one. Okay, so that was part 1. Part 2, right? Part 2 was shorter than part 1, and these are going to get smaller. Nettie, the colored maid, came in late the next afternoon to clean the apartment and found Mrs. Morse in her bed. But then that was not unusual. Usually, though, the sounds of cleaning waked her, and she did not like to wake up. Nettie, an agreeable girl, had learned to move softly about her work. But when she had done the living room and stolen in to tidy the little square bedroom, she could not avoid a tiny clatter as she arranged the objects on the dressing table. Instinctively, she glanced over her shoulder at the sleeper, and without warning, a sickly uneasiness crept over her. She came to the bed and stared down at the woman lying there. So before we even get to she realizes this person might be dead. Just look at how much kind of little racial and class undertones we get, right? I mean, so she's black, and she had to be just like Hazel Morse had to be an agreeable girl, right? She had to be a good sport about everything, no matter how she felt. Nettie, has to be an agreeable woman, just like when we read those chapters in Huckleberry Finn. Jim says, hey, if we could actually make it down this river without aggravating anyone, without talking back to anyone, we could make it. Nettie, if she could be this black homemaker and just clean and get paid and not be worried, she could also kind of get through life unharassed. So, and we get a sense of that, right? Like before we even get to the idea that she might be dead, and Nettie realizing this, right? Instinctively, she glanced over her shoulder at the sleeper, right? Like, oh shit, did I do something that my boss wouldn't like? Mrs. Morse lay on her back, one flabby white arm flung up, the wrist against her forehead. Her stiff hair hung untenderly along her face. The bed covers were pushed down, exposing a deep square of soft neck and a pink nightgown, its fabric worn uneven by many launderings. Her great breasts, freed from their tight confiner, sagged beneath her armpits. Now and then she made knotted, snoring sounds, and from the corner of her open mouth to the blurred turn of her jaw ran a lane of crushed spittle. "Miss Morse," Nettie called. "Oh, Miss Morse, it's terrible late." Mrs. Morse made no move. "Mrs. Morse," said Nettie. "Look, Miss Morse, how am I going to get this bed made?" Panic sprang upon the girl. This reminds me of the scene with in Native Son where Bigger Thomas unintentionally strangles a white woman, and now I'm sure Nettie on some level this panic part of it is kind of oh shit, someone died, but another one is is someone going to blame me for this, and is it easier to do because I'm black? Right, so we get all these little undercurrents. I mean, this is a great story, right? This is a great story all around, but we get these little details that if you're I guess an average or sub-average reader Ellen, oh hell no, you'd probably pass that by, right? It's as if it didn't happen. "I'll wake up, will ya?" she whined. "Please wake up." Suddenly, the girl turned and ran out in the hall to the elevator door, keeping her thumb firm on the black, shiny button until the elderly car and its Negro attendant stood before her. She poured a jumble of words over the boy and led him back to the apartment. He tiptoed creakingly into the bedside, first gingerly, then so lustily that he left marks in the soft flesh. He prodded the unconscious woman. "Hey there," he cried, and listened intently, asked for an echo. Let's reread that paragraph. It's very easy to miss. Suddenly the girl turned and ran out into the hall to the elevator door, keeping her thumb firm on the black, shiny button until the elderly car and its Negro attendant stood before her. She poured a jumble of words over the boy and led him back to the apartment. He tiptoed creakingly into the bedside, first gingerly, then so lustily that he left marks in the soft flesh. He prodded the unconscious woman. Right? So lustily that he left marks in the soft flesh. "Hey there," he cried and listened intently for an echo. "Geez, out like a light," he commented. At his interest in the spectacle, Nettie's panic left her. Importance was big in both of them. They talked in quick and finished whispers, and it was the boy's suggestion that he fetch the young doctor who lived on the ground floor. Nettie hurried along with him. They looked forward to the lime-lit moment of breaking their news of something untoward, something pleasurably unpleasant. Mrs. Morse had become the medium of drama. With no ill wish to her, they hoped that her state was serious, that she would not let them down by being awake and normal on their return. A little fear of this determined them to make the most, to the doctor, of her present condition. "Matter of life and death," returned to Nettie from her thin store of reading. She considered starting the doctor with the phrase. I mean, this is so fucking believable. Even if you eliminate the racial element, but just the class element, right, and the educational element, right? Nettie might not have tons of language, right? She might not read a lot, but she came across this phrase before, matter of life and death, and she wants to feel important, right? You could say this because she's black and oppressed, but she's also a homemaker and oppressed. I can imagine, a white woman in this story. She didn't have to make her black, but making her black adds this additional layer, right? But we have multiple reasons for why these two people are feeling so we want to be in the center of this drama, and we want to feel important, right? As a kind of making up for the fact that in their real lives, right, they don't ever really feel that way. They don't get to feel that way. The doctor was in and none too pleased at the interruption. He wore a yellow and blue striped dressing gown, and he was lying on his sofa laughing with a dark girl. Her face scaly with inexpensive powder, who perched on the arm. Half-emptied highball glasses stood beside them, and her coat and hat were neatly hung up with the comfortable implication of a long stay. So just we're sort of turning these black characters into let us show you, in a very kind of real way, their kind of class issues and their racial feelings. Here we have something similar, but it's kind of like a little more it's more dark. It's a little more slimy, right? And this is like on the part of the doctor, right? Always something, the doctor grumbled. So again, like absolutely no empathy, right? It's like the same kind of like Herbie Moss kind of situation. Stop crabbing. Always something, the doctor grumbled. Couldn't let anybody alone after a hard day. But he put some bottles and instruments into a case, changed his dressing gown for his coat, and started out with the Negroes. Snap it up there, big boy, the girl called after him. Don't be all night. The doctor strode loudly into Mrs. Morse's flat and onto the bedroom, Nettie and the boy right behind him. Mrs. Morse had not moved. Her sleep was as deep, but soundless now. The doctor looked sharply at her, then plunged his thumbs into the lidded pits above her eyeballs and threw his weight upon them. A high, sickened cry broke from Nettie. Looked like he trying to push her right on through the bed, said the boy. He chuckled. Mrs. Morse gave no sign under the pressure. Abruptly, the doctor abandoned it, and with one quick movement swept the covers down to the foot of the bed. With another, he flung her nightgown back and lifted the thick white legs, cross-hatched with blocks of tiny iris-colored veins. He pinched them repeatedly with long, cruel nips, back of the knees. She did not awaken. So just like think of the description of this doctor so far, like, first the type to actually be with a prostitute. Personally, I've just never understood how somebody could just fucking pay for sex and even be turned on to go through with it. It sounds fucking insane to me. But he seems to not care, right? He seems to not really care about other people all that much. He clearly does not care about the dark girl, and obviously, he does not care about Mrs. Morse, right? He does not care about Hazel. He's treating her as this kind of fat body that he's gonna stick his thumbs into the eyelids, right? And just keep in mind that even as a doctor, right, eyes are delicate enough that if you try to do that, you're gonna get even with your eyes closed, you'll very easily get some sort of retinal damage, right? Just by that alone, just by even if a baby sticks a finger into your eye, you could get that. But it doesn't matter, he's just treating her kind of like meat, right? Essentially how she was treated by her suitor. So whether it's the suitors or whether it's the doctor, right, we're getting the same kind of well, that wasn't male violence except for Herbie Morse, but I'd argue this is a kind of careless violence. There's no reason to treat her in this way here. What's she been drinking? He asked Nettie over his shoulder. With the certain celerity of one who knows just where to lay hands on a thing, Nettie went into the bathroom, bound for the cupboard where Mrs. Morse kept her whiskey. But she stopped at the sight of the 2 vials with the red and white labels lying before the mirror. She brought them to the doctor. Oh, for the Lord Almighty's sweet sake, he said. He dropped Mrs. Morse's limp legs and pushed them impatiently across the bed. What does she want to go taking that tripe for? Rotten yellow trick, that's what a thing like that is. Right, so and the trick is that she's not actually dead, right? Now we'll have to pump her out and all that stuff. Nuisance, a thing like that is. That's what it amounts to. Here, George, take me down in the elevator. You wait here, maid. She won't do anything. She won't die me, will she? Cried Nettie. No, said the doctor. God, no. You couldn't kill her with an axe. After 2 days, Mrs. Morse came back to consciousness, dazed at first and with a comprehension that brought with it the slow, saturating wretchedness. Oh, Lord, she moaned. And tears for herself and for life striped her cheeks. Nettie came in at its sound. For 2 days she had done the ugly, incessant tasks and the nursing of the unconscious. For 2 nights she had caught broken bits of sleep on the living room couch. She looked coldly at the big, blown woman on the bed. What you been trying to do, Mrs. Morse, she said. What kind of work is that, taking all that stuff? Oh, Lord, Mrs. Morse again. Oh, Lord, moaned Mrs. Morse again, and she tried to cover her eyes with her arms. But the joints felt stiff and brittle, and she cried out at their ache. There's no way to act taking them pills, said Nettie. You can thank your stars you hear at all. How do you feel now? Oh, I feel great, said Mrs. Morse. Swell, I feel. Her hot, painful tears fell as if they would never stop. That's no way to take on crying like that, Nettie said. After what you done, the doctor, he says he could have you arrested doing a thing like that. He was fit to be tied here. Why couldn't he let me alone, wailed Mrs. Morse. Why the hell couldn't he have? That's terrible, Mrs. Morse, swearing and talking like that, said Nettie. After what people done for you. Here I ain't had no sleep at all, and I had to give up going out to my other ladies. Oh, I'm sorry, Nettie, she said. You're a peach. I'm sorry I've given you so much trouble. I couldn't help it. I just got sunk. Didn't you ever feel like doing it when everything looks just so lousy to you? I wouldn't think of no such thing, declared Nettie. You got to cheer up. That's what you got to do. Everybody's got their troubles. Yeah, said Mrs. Morse, I know. Come a pretty picture card for you, Nettie said. Maybe that'll cheer you up. She handed Mrs. Morse a postcard. Mrs. Morse had to cover one eye with her hand in order to read the message. Her eyes were not yet focusing correctly. This is such like great like black humor, right? Like she's trying to cheer her up like after this like suicide attempt. Nobody bothers to ask, not the doctor, nobody, why did you do this? What's going on? Can I help you in any way? She thinks like she's so like, and that's the thing, like perhaps on some level, like just like we have this disconnect between, Morse and Nettie, as like, black versus white and also a class difference. There might also be a temperamental difference. There might be a difference in terms of like biology as far as like understanding that like there are people that do get depressed, like Hazel might very well be like what in a modern way we think of like as a depressed suicidal person, but Nettie, having never experienced that, right, this is the one kind of like she clearly does not have class or black privilege, right? She has none of that, and barring racial and class privileges, one privilege that she does have that could make this work as a comic moment, right? That doesn't turn Nettie into a black character stereotype, right? But that disconnect, right? That privilege that she does have, that she's not depressed, that she does have perhaps so much life that she does have to deal with day by day, that she's not going to think about suicide, right? To the extent that some suicides are like a disease of affluence, right? This is not something that Nettie probably is going to experience in her life, right? So this is why it's such a nice comic moment, right? So the postcard was from Art. On the back of a view of the Detroit Athletic Club, he had written, "Greeting and salutations. Hope you have lost that gloom. Cheer up and don't take any rubber nickels. See you on Thursday." So again, it's like, cheer up, cheer up. Nobody's going to ask you, right, what's wrong. She dropped the card to the floor. Misery crushed her as if she were between great smooth stones. There passed before her a slow, slow pageant of days spent lying in her flat, of evenings at Jimmy's being a good sport, making herself laugh and coo at art and other arts. She saw a long parade of weary horses and shivering beggars and all beaten, driven, stumbling things. Her feet throbbed as if she had crammed them into the stubby, champagne-colored slippers. Her heart seemed to swell and fester, right? Beautiful little ending, right? The heart swells, like not with love, not with all the kind of, cliched sort of, adjectives you might expect in other contexts, but her heart seemed to swell, right? Like imagine that physically, boom, and fester, right? So why did your heart swell? It's because it got infected and bloated, and now it's full of pus, and this is how I feel, right? Very unconventional language, very unexpected, very good. This is good writing. "Nettie," she cried, "for heaven's sake, pour me a drink, will you?" The maid looked doubtful. "Now you know, Mrs. Moore," she said. "You've been near dead. I don't know if the doctor he'll let you drink nothing yet." "Oh, never mind him," she said. "You get me one and bring in the bottle. Take one yourself." "Well," said Nettie. She poured them each a drink, deferentially leaving hers in the bathroom to be taken in solitude, and brought Mrs. Morse's glass into her. I've obviously read the story before, but I forgot like how many little details we've got like that. Like she is still, even after this interaction, even after this event, she is still black. She is still, employed by this woman. There's still these differences. So, just imagine how deferentially, right? She feels the need to differentially leave hers in the bathroom, right? It's not proper for a black woman, right, to drink in the presence of her white boss. Mrs. Morse looked into the liquor and shuddered back from its odor. Maybe it would help. Maybe when you had been knocked cold for a few days, your very first drink would give you a lift. Maybe whiskey would be her friend again. She prayed without addressing a god, without knowing a god. Oh, please, please let her be able to get drunk. Please keep her always drunk. She lifted the glass. Thanks, Nettie, she said. Here's mud in your eye. The maid giggled. That's the way, Mrs. Morse, she said. You cheer up now. Yeah, said Mrs. Morse. Sure. So again, nobody asks these questions because, again, on some level, who knows? Like, if you haven't been in a depressive state, especially, like a century ago, right? When, circle of empathy was, whether or not liberals want to admit it now, circle of empathy back then was a whole lot narrower, right? And somebody's telling you they're depressed, you're like, what the fuck are you talking about? And some people, right, have so much life to deal with, like perhaps Nettie does, that there really is no place for this kind of, almost affluent sadness.